A stolen ring at a charity gala doesn't just expose a thief. It exposes an entire empire built on the backs of families who had nothing left to lose. When Claire Morgan spotted her grandmother's sapphire brooch pinned to a billionaire's gown, she didn't know she was about to unravel 50 years of systematic theft that destroyed 40 immigrant families. The woman wearing it claimed it had been in her bloodline since 1952. But Claire's grandmother had photographs proving otherwise. Someone was lying. And by the end of the night, that lie would crack open a conspiracy that reached from the marble floors of Manhattan's Plaza Hotel all the way to offshore accounts in Switzerland. This wasn't about one piece of jewelry. This was about what happens when the powerless finally refuse to stay silent. Some objects carry more than beauty. They carry memory, identity, proof that a family once mattered in a world determined to forget them. A brooch passed down through 5 generations doesn't just represent wealth. It represents survival. For the families who fled war-torn Europe with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever treasures they could hide in coat linings. These heirlooms were the only evidence they'd existed before poverty. They were proof of bloodlines, of nobility, of belonging to something greater than the tenement apartments and factory jobs that became their American reality. When those objects disappeared, so did their history, and for 62 years, one family in Queens was told they'd imagined all. Claire Morgan's alarm screamed at 4:47 a.m. in her Astoria studio apartment. The sound cut through dreams of a life where medical bills didn't pile up like accusatory evidence on her kitchen table. She silenced it with fingers that already ached from yesterday's double shift. The apartment smelled of instant coffee and the faint antiseptic scent that clung to her grandmother's belongings. Elena slept in the only bedroom. Her breathing labored even in rest. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer had a sound Claire had learned. It rattled in the chest like old machinery struggling to keep running. 3 months, the doctors said. Maybe less if they couldn't afford the treatments that insurance decided were too expensive for someone 81 years old. Claire moved through the darkness by memory. Medication at 5 a.m. sharp. 2 pills for pain, 1 for nausea, half a tablet for anxiety, because watching yourself die was apparently something that required pharmaceutical management. The pill organizer sat next to the hospital bills. $47,000. The number had stopped feeling real. It was just a fact now, like gravity or the way her back hurt from carrying trays of champagne for people who wouldn't remember her face. Across the city, Victoria Ashford's morning began with her personal trainer arriving at 6 a.m. to her townhouse on East 72nd Street. The room still held the chill of expensive air conditioning, the kind that didn't just cool the air but seemed to purify it of anything common. Her breakfast waited on bone china, egg whites, arugula, coffee imported from a farm in Colombia that her family partially owned. She scrolled through charity board emails while her housekeeper, Rosa, ironed the Valentino gown Victoria would wear to tonight's Heritage Foundation Gala. The dress cost $8,000. Rosa made $11 an hour. Victoria's life moved through spaces where problems got solved with phone calls and checkbooks. The sapphire brooch she planned to wear tonight was just one of dozens of pieces in her collection. She'd chosen it because the blue matched her eyes, and because wearing family heirlooms to charity events felt appropriately symbolic. She didn't think about where it came from. Old money rarely did. The past was just decoration. Pretty stories told at dinner parties about great-grandparents and European tours, and the kind of legacy that opened doors before you even knocked. Claire's world smelled like industrial floor cleaner and desperation. Victoria's world smelled like roses and the particular scent of wealth, not money itself, but the confidence that came from never having to count it. They lived in the same city, but inhabited completely different versions of reality. By midnight, those realities would collide with enough force to shatter everything both women thought they knew about justice, family, and the lies people told themselves to sleep peacefully in houses built on stolen ground. By midnight, one of these women would be fighting for her life. The other would be fighting for her legacy. Neither would emerge unchanged. The Plaza Hotel ballroom at 3 p.m. was organized chaos. Claire arrived through the service entrance, her black uniform pressed until it looked almost expensive. The transformation had already begun. White linens draped over tables like snowfall. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across marble floors polished to mirror shine. Ice sculptures sweated under warming lights while florists arranged roses that cost more per stem than Claire made in an hour. The air tasted like money about to be spent on feeling good about having money. She checked her reflection in the staff bathroom mirror. Dark circles under her eyes that concealer couldn't quite hide. Hair pulled back tight enough to give her a headache by hour 3. The uniform made her invisible, which was the point. Rich people didn't want to see the hands that served them. They wanted glasses to appear and disappear like magic. Problem solved by people who didn't really exist outside of their function. Claire smoothed the fabric over her stomach and whispered the prayer her grandmother taught her. Not to God exactly, but to survival, to making it through one more night, to the hope that somewhere in the mathematics of suffering, the equation eventually balanced. She didn't know that tonight, the numbers would finally start adding up. She didn't know that the brooch she'd seen in faded photographs her entire life was about to walk through those ballroom doors, pinned to a woman who had no idea what she was wearing. This isn't a fairy tale. There's no glass slipper, no prince, no magic that makes poverty disappear at midnight. This is a story about what happens when someone powerless sees something impossible and refuses to look away. This is about the brutal math of justice delayed for 62 years, about the interest that compounds on stolen dignity, about what it costs when the truth finally comes due. If you think some debts eventually expire, you're about to learn otherwise. Subscribe now, because what happens next doesn't just change 2 lives. It exposes how an entire system protects itself when the wrong person asks the right question. The subway to Manhattan smelled like wet metal and other people's mornings. Claire stood pressed between a construction worker and a woman in scrubs. All 3 of them held upright by exhaustion and the rhythm of the train. Her grandmother had been awake when she left, sitting at the kitchen table with tea gone cold in front of her. Elena's hand shook when she hugged Claire goodbye, the kind of trembling that came from a body eating itself from inside out. She'd whispered the same thing she always did before Claire left for Gala shifts. Hold your head up. You come from people who mattered. Claire carried those words like armor, even though they felt thinner every day. The hospital had called again that morning. $47,000. Payment plans exhausted. Insurance maximums reached. Numbers that translated to how many weeks her grandmother had left. Victoria Ashford arrived at the plaza in a town car with her husband Thomas, a hedge fund manager whose presence at charity events fulfilled some unspoken contract of their marriage. They moved through the entrance with the casual grace of people who belonged everywhere. Air kisses for the senator's wife. A warm handshake for the museum director. Victoria's dress caught light like water, and at her shoulder, the brooch glittered. 3 sapphires arranged in a star pattern around a central diamond. She'd chosen it because blue complemented her coloring and because wearing heirloom pieces to heritage events felt appropriately thematic. Thomas made a joke about her looking like old money. She laughed because that was the goal. Claire was collecting empty champagne flutes near the main staircase when she saw it. The world didn't stop. That only happened in movies. But something inside her chest seized hard enough that she nearly dropped the tray. There, pinned to Victoria Ashford's shoulder, was the brooch. Not similar, not reminiscent. The exact piece her grandmother had described 10,000 times. The star pattern with sapphires the color of midnight over the Adriatic. The white gold setting that caught light and threw back like defiance. And there on the left, sapphire, the tiny chip that made it impossible to replicate. Claire's hands went numb. The tray tilted, but she caught it, muscle memory overriding shock. Her grandmother's voice filled her head. 3 sapphires, La Mia Stella. My father had it made in Florence when I turned 16. The jeweler's mark inside, MC Florence 1961. And the chip here on the left stone. I begged him not to repair it. Every flaw makes something irreplaceable. Elena had shown her the photographs. So many times the images were burned into Claire's memory. Her great-grandfather unpinning it from Elena's yellow dress on September 15th, 1963. The shame in his eyes. The men in suits with legal papers that weren't quite legal. The promise it would be returned in 30 days. 62 years of waiting. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't possible. Grandmother said it had been stolen, lost forever into the machinery of old money and lawyers who knew how to make immigrant families disappear. But there it was 3 feet away, on a woman who probably didn't even remember putting it on. The chip caught the light, exactly where it should be, exactly as Elena described. Claire's vision tunneled. Every photograph, every tear-streaked retelling. Every time her mother called Elena confused. Every cousin who stopped believing. All of it crystallized into this single moment. She couldn't approach. What would she even say? "Excuse me, you're wearing my grandmother's stolen property?" They'd throw her out. They'd call security. They'd fire her, and she needed this job, needed the money for medication that bought her grandmother days, maybe weeks. But Elena's face appeared in her mind, the way she looked when she talked about that night in 1963, the humiliation that had settled into her bones and never left. 62 years of being called a liar. 62 years of other people deciding her truth didn't matter. Claire watched Victoria laugh with a woman wearing diamonds that probably cost more than Claire's entire life. She waited, patient as poverty had taught her to be. She collected glasses, refilled champagne, became invisible the way servers were trained to be. But she never let Victoria out of her sight. When the moment came, Victoria standing alone, momentarily separated from her group, Claire moved. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Excuse me, ma'am." Victoria turned, her expression polite but distant, the look reserved for help. "I couldn't help but notice your brooch. It's beautiful." Victoria's hand went to it automatically, a gesture of ownership. "Thank you. It's been in my family for generations." Claire's throat tightened. "May I ask where it came from? The pattern is so unusual." Something shifted in Victoria's face. Not suspicion yet, but awareness that this conversation was veering off script. "It was commissioned in Florence. 1952, I believe." "Why do you ask?" "Because my grandmother wore an identical piece." Claire kept her voice level, professional. "The star sapphire pattern. 3 stones around the center diamond. And there's a chip on the left sapphire. Small but distinctive." Victoria's fingers touched the stone. The chip was there. Claire watched her feel it, watched the moment of recognition cross her face. But instead of curiosity, Victoria's expression hardened. "My family has extensive documentation of this piece's provenance. It was authenticated by Sotheby's, one of a kind. So was my grandmother's." Claire's heart was a drum. "She has the original receipt from a jeweler, MC Florence. She has photographs of her wearing it. And she has the memory of the night it was taken from her." Taken. Victoria's voice went cold. "I think you're mistaken. This has been in the Ashford family since my grandmother purchased it at auction in 1978. 1978. Claire's voice shook now. 15 years after it was stolen from my family. A security guard had started moving their direction. Other guests were glancing over. The event coordinator appeared at Victoria's elbow, her smile frozen in place. Victoria drew herself up, every inch the society woman dealing with an unfortunate situation. "Your grandmother was confused. These costume jewelry delusions are common among elderly people, particularly those who worked in service. I'm sure the similarity is coincidental." The words landed like slaps. Confused, delusions, service, each one designed to put Claire back in her place, to remind her that people like her didn't question people like Victoria. The security guard was closer now. Victoria reached into her clutch and pulled out 2 crisp $100 bills. "For your discretion and your departure. I'm sure you understand." She held out the money like Claire was a problem that could be solved with cash. Like 62 years of her grandmother's pain could be bought for $200. The coordinator touched Claire's elbow, guiding her away. Victoria had already turned back to her conversation. The incident dismissed, forgotten before it even finished happening. But Claire wasn't moving. "My grandmother has proof. She has photographs. And I'm going to prove one of us is wearing stolen property." The security guard's hand closed on her arm. Victoria didn't even look back. She was already laughing at something the museum director said, the brooch catching light at her shoulder, the chip in the left sapphire glinting like an accusation no one else could see. The service corridor smelled like grease and disappointment. Claire's supervisor, Marcus, had his arms crossed over his chest, his face the particular shade of angry that came from having to deal with problems during an event. The security guard stood behind her like she might run, like she was the criminal here. "What the hell were you thinking?" Marcus's voice was low but sharp. You accused a guest of wearing stolen jewelry. Victoria Ashford. Do you have any idea who she is? I know exactly who she is. Claire's voice shook. And I know what she's wearing belonged to my grandmother. Your grandmother. Marcus said it like the words tasted bad. Claire, I've worked with you for 2 years. You're reliable. You keep your head down. And tonight you decide to cause a scene with one of the event's primary donors over a brooch. It's not just a brooch. I don't care what it is. Marcus held up his hand. Mrs. Ashford's assistant already called. They want you removed from the premises. They're considering whether to file a complaint. I'm considering whether to fire you on the spot. The words hit like cold water. Claire needed this job, needed the money, the health insurance that barely covered anything but was better than nothing. Marcus, please, if you just let me explain. Explain to unemployment. He turned away. Finish the shift. Stay in the kitchen. Don't go near the guests. And pray Mrs. Ashford doesn't push this further. Claire stood in the corridor after he left, the security guard's eyes still on her. Her hands were shaking. The bathroom stall gave her 3 minutes of privacy before someone knocked. She called her grandmother, her fingers fumbling the phone. Claire? Elena's voice was weak, confused by the late call. None, I saw it. The brooch. It's here. A woman is wearing it. Silence. Then a sound Claire had heard too many times. Her grandmother crying. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that came from wounds so old they'd become part of who you were. Are you certain? The chip is there. Exactly where you said. Everything matches. They won't believe you. Elena's voice carried 62 years of experience. People like us, Miss Stella, we don't get believed. Victoria Ashford returned to the ballroom like nothing had happened. Because for her nothing had. A confused server. An awkward moment. Already forgotten beneath the weight of more important things. She rejoined Thomas near the silent auction tables, accepted a fresh glass of champagne, smiled at the foundation directors, joked about charity galas being where rich people paid to feel good about being rich. From the kitchen doorway, Claire watched. She watched Victoria laugh, watched her touch the brooch absently, adjusting it without thought, watched her move through that glittering world where problems got solved with phone calls and checkbooks, where the word of a server meant nothing against authentication papers and family names that opened doors. The gulf between them wasn't just about money. It was about whose truth mattered, whose memory counted, whose pain was real enough to be acknowledged. Victoria would go home tonight to her townhouse. She'd take off the brooch and put it in a jewelry box with dozens of other pieces she barely remembered owning. She'd sleep in sheets that cost more than Claire made in a month. And she'd never think about this again. Claire would go home to Astoria, to medical bills and a grandmother dying by degrees, to the weight of being called a liar for telling the truth, to the mathematics of poverty that never quite added up no matter how many shifts she worked. The subway ride home was long enough for rage to settle into something colder. Determination. Elena was waiting up, still dressed, sitting at the kitchen table like she'd been frozen there since Claire's call. In front of her sat a shoebox Claire had seen 100 times, but never opened. Elena's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. I saved everything. Her voice was paper thin. Your great-grandfather made me promise. He said someday someone would believe us. I don't think he really thought it would happen, but he made me promise anyway. The receipt came first. Yellowed, creased from decades of careful storage. M.C. Florence, September 1961. 1 custom brooch, 3 Burma sapphires, 1 center diamond, 18-karat white gold. Commissioned by Count Giovanni Rossini. The price in lire converted to $3,000. A fortune in 1961. Below it, photographs. Elena at 16, radiant in a white dress, the brooch at her shoulder. The star pattern unmistakable. The chip already there. A flaw her father refused to fix because perfection was common but character was rare. September 15th, 1963. Elena's finger touched a photograph of her father. That's the night they came. I was working at a gala, just like you tonight. My father came to pick me up, and these men were waiting. They had papers. They said certain assets from foreign nationals needed to be authenticated. They said it was temporary, 30 days. They threatened deportation if we refused. Her voice cracked. My father had fled Mussolini. He'd lost everything once already. He couldn't risk losing his daughter. So he unpinned it from my dress. Right there in the service corridor. The same kind of corridor you were standing in tonight. More photographs. Letters from lawyers saying the piece had been authenticated and sold to cover administrative fees. Documents showing the Ashford family acquiring it at auction 15 years later. Paper trails that made theft look legal. Elena pulled out a notebook, pages filled with dates, names, attempts to recover what was stolen. Calls to police who didn't care. Letters to lawyers who wouldn't take the case. Decades of being dismissed as confused, bitter, delusional. Everyone stopped believing me. Elena's tears fell on the photographs. Your mother, your aunts. They said I was stuck in the past. They said I needed to let it go. But it wasn't just a brooch, Claire. It was proof we'd been someone. Proof we'd mattered before we became just another immigrant family working for people who didn't see us. Claire's phone screen cracked when she opened it. A spiderweb fracture across the glass that matched how she felt inside. She searched for lawyers. Read reviews. Found firm after firm that specialized in estate recovery, art theft, heirloom disputes. Started calling the next morning. Got the same answer in different words. The Ashford family had resources. They had reputation. They had lawyers who made problems disappear. Cases like this took years, cost hundreds of thousands, and rarely won. Most firms wouldn't touch it. The ones that would wanted retainers Claire couldn't afford if she worked 3 lifetimes. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. To protect people like Victoria. To exhaust people like Claire. To make sure that truth without money stayed buried under paperwork and legal fees and the slow grind of justice that only served those who could afford to wait. If you scroll past this story, you become part of why it keeps happening. The algorithm buries what people don't engage with. Families like Elena stay silent because nobody clicks, nobody cares, nobody proves their pain matters enough to fight back. Subscribe right now, not later. Now. Because every person who doesn't is telling families like this that their truth can stay buried. September 15th, 1963 was a Tuesday. Elena remembered because Tuesdays meant the gala at the plaza ended earlier, meant she could catch the last train home without walking through dark streets alone. She was 19 years old and wore a pale yellow silk dress her mother had sewn from fabric Elena bought with her own money. The brooch at her shoulder caught every light in the room, and for those few hours, she felt like she still belonged to the world her family had lost. The ballroom smelled like champagne and the particular perfume wealthy women wore, something French and expensive that Elena couldn't name but would remember forever. She wasn't serving that night. She worked in the coat check, a position that felt safer, less visible. Her father came to walk her home like he always did. Giovanni Rossini, once a count, now a tailor in Brooklyn. His hands stained with fabric dye and his eyes carrying the weight of everything he'd lost fleeing Mussolini's Italy. They were in the service corridor when the men appeared. 3 of them in dark suits that looked government-issued. The lead man's name was Richard Whitmore, though Elena wouldn't learn that until decades later. He was 28 years old, a junior attorney building his career on knowing which families to target. He smiled when he spoke, which made it worse somehow. Mr. Rossini, we need to discuss certain valuables in your possession that require authentication. Her father's English was broken, threaded with Italian that came faster when he was nervous. I have papers, everything legitimate. We are legal citizens. Of course. Whitmore's smile never wavered. This is merely administrative. We've had reports of European antiquities entering the country through irregular channels. Your daughter's brooch, for instance. We'll need to verify its provenance. Elena's hand went to it instinctively. This was my birthday gift. My father had it made. Then you have nothing to worry about. Whitmore held out his hand. 30 days for authentication. You'll get it back with proper documentation. Unless, of course, there's a problem with your family's immigration status. Then things become more complicated. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Giovanni had seen this before. Different country, different men in suits, same underlying message. Comply or lose everything. His hand shook when he reached for the brooch. Elena felt the weight of it leave her shoulder, felt something essential tear away. Her father placed it in Whitmore's palm like he was surrendering more than jewelry. He was surrendering proof they'd been someone. Proof they'd mattered. 30 days, Whitmore repeated, already turning away. We'll be in touch. They never were. Letters to the address Whitmore provided came back undeliverable. The police said it was a civil matter. Lawyers said they couldn't help without retainer fees Giovanni couldn't afford. The family's reputation in their small Brooklyn community shifted. Whispers started. Maybe they'd never really been nobility. Maybe the whole Count story was a fantasy. Maybe Elena's brooch had been costume jewelry all along, and she just couldn't accept her family's diminished status. The theft destroyed them slowly. Giovanni died 5 years later, the shame of that night having eaten something vital out of him. Elena's mother never spoke of it, which was its own kind of death. When Elena tried to tell her own children the story, they exchanged glances, gentle suggestions that maybe she was misremembering. Maybe grief had distorted the details. Maybe it was time to let it go. 62 years of being called confused, of having her truth dismissed as delusion, of watching her family's history get erased by people who decided her pain wasn't real enough to matter. Now, in 2025, that history was killing her. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer had a timeline measured in weeks. The hospital room at Queens General smelled like antiseptic, and the particular scent of bodies giving up. Elena's doctor had the conversation with Claire in the hallway, his voice low and professional, delivering death like a diagnosis. 3 months at most. The tumors aren't responding to treatment. We can manage pain, but the cost. He trailed off, looking at Claire's face, at the calculations already happening behind her eyes. $47,000 in current debt. Another $12,000 per month for palliative care. Insurance that had hit its lifetime maximum. The hospital's billing department had called 3 times that week. Polite voices delivering impolite ultimatums. Payment plans exhausted. Options narrowed to impossible choices. Claire sat in the hospital cafeteria at 2 a.m., calculator app open on her cracked phone screen. Rent was $1,500. Utilities $200. Grandmother's medications $800 even with assistance programs. Food maybe $300 if she stretched it. Her 3 jobs brought in about $4,000 a month before taxes. The math didn't work. It had never worked. She'd been running a deficit since her mother died, since she became the only one left who still believed Elena's stories. Sometimes she caught herself wondering if everyone else was right, if her grandmother had gotten confused over the years, merged memories, created a more noble past to cope with a difficult present. Then she'd look at the photographs, at the receipt, at the jeweler's marked documentation, at her grandmother's face when she talked about that night. You couldn't fake that kind of wound. Some pain was too specific to be imagined. The theft had poisoned 3 generations. Elena's children grew up ashamed of their mother's obsession with a piece of jewelry they'd never seen. Claire's mother, Maria, had been bitter about it, refused to hear the story after a while. We're poor because we're poor, not because someone stole a brooch 50 years ago. Let it go. Move on. She died angry, never having reconciled with the past Elena couldn't release. Claire's cousins didn't believe either. Family gatherings became exercises in changing the subject when Elena mentioned Florence or 1963 or the men in suits. They pitted her, humored her, treated her truth like a comfortable delusion they'd learned to accommodate. By the time Claire was old enough to form her own opinions, she was the only one who still listened, the only one who looked at the evidence and saw what it meant. Being the sole believer in someone else's truth was a particular kind of loneliness. It meant defending your grandmother against your own family. It meant watching people exchange glances when Elena started talking. It meant being called gullible, naive, unable to accept reality. It meant choosing between your family's peace and your grandmother's dignity. Claire recorded Elena on her phone 3 days after the gala. Her grandmother sat propped against pillows, oxygen tube in her nose, voice thin but clear. I am Elena Rossini. 62 years ago, my father's brooch was taken from us by men who knew we had no power to fight back. They knew immigrant families don't get justice. They knew our truth didn't matter. I have lived my whole life being called a liar. I am dying being called a liar. This recording is my testimony. The brooch exists. It was stolen. And I am not confused. Her hands shook when she held up the photographs. This is me at 16. This is my father. This is the receipt from Florence. This is what they took from us. Not just jewelry. Proof we'd been someone. Proof we'd mattered. They didn't just steal gold and sapphires. They stole our history. The recording was 4 minutes long. Elena cried through most of it. The weight of 62 years of dismissed truth, of being gaslit by an entire system, of dying without vindication. Claire uploaded it to her laptop and made 7 backup copies. Whatever happened next, her grandmother's voice would survive. That night, alone in her apartment, Claire made a decision. This wasn't about money anymore. It wasn't even about the brooch. It was about dignity, about proving her grandmother had mattered, that her pain was real, that her truth deserved to exist in a world that had spent 6 decades trying to erase it. Even if it cost Claire everything, even if she lost. Some things were worth fighting for even when the math guaranteed you'd lose. The New York Public Library on 42nd Street opened at 10 a.m. Claire was there at 9:45, waiting with the delivery workers and tourists, her laptop bag heavy on her shoulder. The building smelled like old paper and possibility. She'd called in sick to all 3 jobs, a decision that would cost her about $300 she couldn't afford to lose. But she had the photographs. She had the receipt. And she had her grandmother's voice on a recording that made her chest tight every time she played it. The genealogy and local history room was quiet at this hour. Claire claimed a desk near the window and opened her laptop. Her research method was desperate and disorganized. More hope than strategy. She searched for property seizure records from 1963, immigration and customs documentation, legal precedents for recovering stolen heirlooms. Her eyes burned from the screen, from lack of sleep, from the sheer weight of not knowing what she was doing. 3 hours in, she found something. A digitized record from the New York City Municipal Archives. September 1963. A series of asset seizures under the Foreign Assets Verification Program. A bureaucratic title that sounded official but left no trail in actual government records. 17 families, all immigrants, all forced to surrender valuables for authentication. The program disappeared in 1964 with no final reports, no returned items, no paper trail except these initial seizure documents. Elena's name was there. Giovanni Rossini, September 15, 1963. 1 sapphire brooch. Seized by R. Whitmore verification agent. Claire's hands shook. This was real. Documented. Not her grandmother's confused memory, but actual recorded history. She photographed the screen, sent it to her phone. Made 2 backup copies before the library system could glitch. That night, she took the subway to the Diamond District on 47th Street. The jeweler her grandmother mentioned, MC Florence, was long closed. But other jewelers had been there for decades. The 3rd shop she tried, an elderly man named Samuel looked at the photographs through a loupe, his face changing as he studied them. This maker's mark. His voice carried a Russian accent, softened by 50 years in New York. I know this work. Massimo Coltelli, Florence. He trained my uncle. Closed his shop in 1967. But his pieces... Samuel looked up, his eyes sharp. This is authentic. The sapphires, this arrangement, he only did this pattern twice. Custom commission work. Where did you get these photographs? My grandmother. It was hers. Stolen in 1963. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. These stones came from a specific mine in Burma. Closed in 1962. The gold alloy is distinctive. Massimo makes his own. If this piece still exists, I can prove its origin. Claire called experts from the library, from her apartment at 2 a.m. During her lunch breaks at the job she returned to because rent didn't stop while she played detective. A metallurgist at Columbia University agreed to analyze the photographs. His report came back 3 days later. The gold alloy composition visible in the high-resolution images matched known samples of Coltelli's work. The sapphire's color and clarity were consistent with the Mogok region of Burma during the specific period before the mine's closure. A gemologist in the Diamond District examined the photographs and corroborated the findings. The central diamond's cut was characteristic of early 1960s European craftsmanship. The setting technique matched Caltelli's documented methods. 3 independent experts, none of whom knew each other, all confirming what Elena had been saying for 62 years. The brooch was real. It was exactly what she claimed. Claire compiled everything into a folder that grew thicker each day. The 1963 seizure records, the jeweler testimonies, the metallurgical analysis, the gemological report, the photographs showing the progression of the brooch from Elena's shoulder to the Ashford collection. She barely slept. Food became whatever she could eat while typing. Her apartment accumulated coffee cups and printouts and the particular chaos of someone racing against time they didn't have. The call came on a Tuesday. Unknown number, professional voice. Ms. Morgan, this is Catherine Ross, assistant to Victoria Ashford. Mrs. Ashford would like to speak with you. Would you be available for coffee Thursday morning? Claire's heart stopped. Why? Mrs. Ashford has been conducting her own research. She preferred to discuss it in person. They met at a cafe in Midtown, neutral territory where neither woman had advantage. Victoria arrived 15 minutes early, which Claire only knew because she'd arrived 20 minutes early herself. They sat across from each other like opposing generals at a negotiation neither wanted to be having. Victoria looked different away from the Gala's glitter. Tired, uncertain. She ordered coffee she didn't drink and stared at the folder in front of her. I had the brooch authenticated. Again, by experts who didn't know why I was asking. Claire waited. Victoria's hands shook slightly when she opened the folder. The sapphires matched the Burma mine your grandmother claimed. The gold alloy is consistent with this Caltelli jeweler. The Sotheby's provenance my family has? It appears 15 years after your family's piece was seized. The auction house has no documentation of where it came from before that. So you believe me? I don't know what I believe. Victoria's voice cracked. My grandmother bought this at auction in 1978. She's been dead for 10 years. She couldn't have known it was stolen. My family's entire collection. I started looking at other pieces. Similar patterns. Items appearing in the late 70s and 80s with vague European provenance. Immigrant families like yours losing heirlooms in the 60s. Then those same pieces surfacing in auctions years later. She pulled out her own research. Auction records. Historical seizure documents. A pattern that made Claire's stomach drop. 40 families between 1961 and 1967. 17 in New York alone. All immigrants. All threatened with deportation or legal complications. All forced to surrender valuables that disappeared into a system designed to make them disappear. There's one name on every seizure document. Victoria slid a paper across the table. Richard Whitmore. He's my family's attorney. Has been for 40 years. He helped my grandmother build her collection. He authenticated every piece. He's the one who told me your grandmother was confused. The cafe noise faded. Claire looked at the document, at Whitmore's signature for 1963, then at Victoria's face. He orchestrated this. All of it. I think so. Victoria's voice was barely audible. And I think if we investigate further, we become targets. I don't care. You should. Victoria leaned forward. My family has resources. Money, lawyers, connections. If we do this together, we might actually have a chance. But I need to know you understand what we're walking into. Whitmore has protected himself for 50 years. He won't go quietly. Claire thought of her grandmother. 3 months to live. 62 years of being called a liar. The weight of that truth on Elena's chest, pressing down harder than the cancer. I understand. Victoria extended her hand across the table. Then we have a partnership, and we need to move fast. 40 families destroyed so people like Whitmore could profit. 50 years of systematic theft disguised as authentication. Your subscription tells those families their pain matters. Your silence tells them it doesn't. Which side are you on? Subscribe now because this story only gets told if people care enough to watch it. Richard Whitmore's office occupied the top floor of a building on Park Avenue where even the lobby smelled expensive. When Victoria called him with news of her investigation into family heirlooms, he'd been delighted to help. 73 years old, silver hair perfectly trimmed, suits custom tailored in London, voice like old money poured over decades of Yale education. He'd been the Ashford family attorney since 1985, managing estates, authenticating acquisitions, making legal problems disappear with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it long enough to forget it was wrong. Victoria, darling. He'd hugged her in his office, leather and mahogany and oil paintings of ships. Your grandmother would be so pleased you're taking interest in the collection. What can I do to help? He provided everything. Access to archives normally closed to public research. International contacts at auction houses in London, Paris, Florence. Authentication experts who owed him favors accumulated over decades. Phone calls that opened doors Victoria didn't even know existed. Within a week, their investigation had resources Claire couldn't have accessed in a lifetime. Whitmore treated Claire with careful courtesy when they met, the kind of politeness that was itself a form of condescension. Ms. Morgan, I understand your grandmother has memories of a similar piece. Family stories can be so powerful, can't they? Often the emotional truth matters more than the factual accuracy. Claire smiled and nodded and took notes while rage built behind her teeth. Because he was good, helpful and charming and so obviously committed to uncovering the truth that suspecting him felt paranoid. He brought them coffee from his assistant, shared stories about Victoria's grandmother, expressed sympathy for Elena's condition, offered to have his own experts review the documentation, free of charge, just to help resolve the matter. The investigation accelerated under his guidance. International databases, auction house records going back to the 1950s, immigration archives from 3 countries, everything proceeding exactly as it should, building toward conclusions that felt inevitable. Victoria's grandmother had bought the brooch legitimately. The similarity to Elena's piece was remarkable, but ultimately coincidental. These things happen. Perhaps a settlement could be reached, something generous that would help with Elena's medical care. Claire's cousin Marcus was the one who found it. Not the cousin named Marcus who didn't believe Elena's stories, but the other Marcus, the one who worked in IT and had recreational hobbies that lived in legal gray areas. He'd been running an unauthorized search through property records databases, the kind of search that was technically illegal but too useful to ignore. Whitmore's name appeared in places it shouldn't have been. The same signature from the 1963 seizure documents showed up on authentication papers from 1978, then 1982, then 1989. Sales records from offshore accounts, commission payments that didn't match legitimate attorney fees, a 50-year trail of theft disguised as legal transactions, all leading back to the man who was currently helping them investigate. Marcus called Claire at 3 a.m. Stop telling him what you're finding. Stop meeting with him. Get somewhere public and stay there. They met Victoria at the same cafe, showed her the evidence on a laptop Marcus had encrypted 6 different ways. Bank transfers, offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands totaling $14 million, authentication fraud going back to 1961, 40 families, 67 documented pieces, a systematic operation that had turned immigrant desperation into a retirement fund. Victoria's face went white. We've been feeding him everything, every piece of evidence, every expert we've contacted. He knows exactly what we know, and he knows you're suspicious. Claire's voice shook. We just told the architect of a 50-year fraud ring that we're investigating him. The brake line failure happened 2 days later. Victoria's car, routine maintenance. The mechanic finding cut lines that should have failed during her morning commute. The police called it vandalism. Claire knew better. So did the anonymous text that arrived on her phone that night. Some truths are better left buried. Ask yourself if this is worth your life. Whitmore had one final gala scheduled. The Heritage Preservation Foundation annual benefit. 3 weeks away. His retirement announcement planned. A final auction of authenticated European heirlooms, with buyers already lined up. Then Switzerland, where extradition was complicated and $14 million could buy comfortable silence forever. Claire and Victoria had 3 weeks to expose a conspiracy that had survived 50 years. And the man who built it now knew they were coming. The Heritage Preservation Foundation Gala fell on October 12th, exactly 50 years to the day after Whitmore had processed his final asset verification in 1975 before the program mysteriously dissolved. The Plaza Ballroom looked identical to how it had in 1963. Same marble floors, Same crystal chandeliers throwing fractured light across silk and diamonds. History repeating itself in the same room where it had first gone wrong. Elena arrived in a wheelchair, Claire pushing her through the service and trance they'd used 62 years apart. Her grandmother wore the pale yellow silk dress from 1963, altered to fit a body that cancer had hollowed out. It hung differently now, loose where it had once been fitted. But the color was exact. Elena had saved it all these years, wrapped in tissue paper like a burial shroud for the girl she'd been before shame became part of her identity. Marcus, the IT cousin, sat in a van 3 blocks away, laptop balanced on his knees, fingers moving across keys with the precision of someone who'd spent years learning to be invisible in digital spaces. He'd hacked the ballroom's presentation system 2 days earlier, leaving backdoor access that the venue's security would never find. The evidence was loaded, ready. Photographs, bank records, audio files, offshore account statements. 50 years of theft compiled into a 17-minute presentation that would either destroy Whitmore or get them all arrested. Victoria moved through the crowd with practiced ease, air-kissing the museum director, laughing at the senator's joke, wearing a dress that cost less than usual, because tonight wasn't about appearing wealthy. Tonight was about choosing which side of history she wanted to stand on. The brooch was in her clutch, wrapped in silk. She'd worn it to every event for 2 months. Let Whitmore see it. Let him think everything is fine. Let him believe she'd accepted his explanations and moved on. Claire worked the coat check, invisible in her black uniform, watching guests arrive. Whitmore entered at 7:15 p.m., distinguished in his tuxedo, silver hair catching light like a crown. People gravitated toward him. He was beloved in these circles, philanthropist, preservationist, man who dedicated his life to protecting family legacies. The foundation was giving him their Lifetime Achievement Award. His retirement speech was scheduled for 8 p.m., right before the final auction of the authenticated European pieces he'd spent 5 decades stealing. The ballroom hummed with wealth and self-congratulation. Champagne flowed. The silent auction tables displayed jewelry and art with price tags that would cover Elena's medical debt 20 times over. Whitmore held court near the bar, telling stories about preservation work, about saving heirlooms from obscurity, about the sacred duty of protecting heritage. Every word was true in the worst possible way. At 7:55 p.m., the foundation director called everyone to attention. Whitmore took the stage to applause that felt like validation, like proof his life had mattered in ways that transcended the methods he'd used to build it. He began his speech about legacy, about the privilege of protecting family histories, about objects carrying memory across generations. Heritage isn't just what we inherit, Whitmore said, his voice carrying practiced warmth. It's what we choose to preserve. For 50 years, I've had the honor of helping families protect their. The screens behind him flickered. His presentation disappeared. For 3 seconds, there was only blue screen and confused murmuring. Then Elena's face filled every monitor in the ballroom. 16 years old in the photograph, wearing yellow silk, the brooch at her shoulder catching light exactly as it had that night in 1963. The presentation moved with brutal efficiency. Elena's photograph overlaid with Victoria wearing the identical piece 2 months ago. Same star pattern, same chip on the left sapphire, zoom on the flaw, magnified until everyone could see it was impossible to replicate. Then the jeweler's documentation. MC Florence, 1961. Commissioned by Count Giovanni Rossini. The receipt, yellowed but readable on the 6-foot screens. Cut to the seizure document. September 15th, 1963. R. Whitmore verification agent. Giovanni Rossini forced to surrender 1 sapphire brooch. Promise of 30-day return. Then the auction record from 1978, 15 years later. Same piece sold to the Ashford family. No documentation of origin. Authenticated by Richard Whitmore. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Whitmore's face drained of color. He reached for the microphone, but no words came. The screens kept rolling. Bank transfers. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. $14 million accumulated over 50 years. Names of 40 families. Dates of seizures. Dates of sales. Commission payments that tracked perfectly with every transaction. Then the audio. Whitmore's voice from a 1989 phone call someone had recorded and saved, discussing a procurement with an auction house representative. Immigrant families never have resources to fight. No one questions old money. As long as the papers look legitimate, provenance is whatever we say it is. The reaction rippled through the ballroom like physical force. Gasps, whispers that built to accusations. People turned to stare at Whitmore, who stood frozen at the podium like a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. He opened his mouth, closed it, tried to form words that wouldn't come. Claire stepped out from behind the coat check station. Every eye in the room tracked her movement as she walked toward the stage. She'd practiced this moment in her mirror 100 times, but nothing prepared her for the weight of 400 people's attention, for the power of finally being seen. My name is Claire Morgan. Her voice shook, but carried. 62 years ago tonight, in this exact room, my great-grandfather was forced to surrender our family's heirloom. The man who forced him to do it is standing before you. Richard Whitmore built his career on theft. He built his reputation on destroying families who had no power to fight back. He built his fortune on the assumption that no one would ever care enough to investigate. Whitmore found his voice. This is slander. I have documentation. You have forgeries. Victoria stood, walked to the stage, every head turning to follow her movement. She reached the podium and placed a brooch on it, the sapphires catching light. This piece belongs to the Rossini family. It was stolen. My family bought it unknowingly, but that doesn't change what it is. Stolen property. She turned to face the audience, to face friends and fellow board members, and everyone who'd known her since birth. Richard Whitmore didn't just steal from one family. He stole from 40, for 50 years. And every one of us in this room benefited from a system designed to make sure people like the Rossinis never got justice. Claire's phone chimed. The live stream Marcus had started 10 minutes ago had 40,000 viewers and climbing. Comments flooded in faster than anyone could read them. The story was escaping the ballroom, spreading through social media like wildfire, becoming impossible to contain or control or dismiss as one confused family's delusion. The rear doors opened. Federal agents in dark suits moved through the crowd with the efficiency of people who'd been planning this moment for months. At the front stood Attorney General Rebecca Chen, flanked by FBI investigators who'd been building a case since Victoria had contacted them 6 weeks ago with evidence too substantial to ignore. Richard Whitmore, you're under arrest for fraud, theft, conspiracy, and violation of federal statutes governing authentication and interstate commerce. Chen's voice carried absolute authority. You have the right to remain. The rest disappeared under the noise of 400 people talking at once, phones out, recording everything. The story already mutating into a dozen versions that would dominate news cycles for weeks. Whitmore's face had gone gray. He didn't resist when they cuffed him, didn't speak when they read his rights, just stared at Claire like he was seeing her for the first time, like he'd finally realized that invisible people could become witnesses. Elena was wheeled to the front, and the room quieted again. She looked impossibly small in the yellow dress, her body wasted by cancer. But her voice was clear when she spoke. I have waited 62 years to be believed, to have someone look at my truth and decide it mattered. This man stole more than jewelry. He stole proof we've been someone. He stole our history. And he did it because he knew people like us don't get justice. She held up the brooch, her hands trembling. This belongs to my family. It always has. And I will die knowing that truth finally won. This is what vindication looks like after 62 years. Subscribe so we keep uncovering stories they want buried. Don't let this be the last one. 3 months later, the legal machinery had processed what the ballroom had witnessed. Whitmore's authentication fraud ring had stretched across 4 decades and 3 continents. Federal investigators identified 67 families whose heirlooms had been stolen through the same systematic method. Property seizures disguised as verification procedures. Vulnerable immigrant families threatened with legal consequences they couldn't afford to fight. Objects disappearing into offshore storage before resurfacing at auction with fabricated provenance. The courts ruled swiftly. Whitmore's assets were frozen and liquidated. $14 million became a restitution fund divided among the families who could prove their claims. Elena's medical bills were paid in full, along with 3 months of home hospice care that insurance had deemed too expensive. The brooch was legally returned to the Rossini family on December 3rd in a ceremony attended by representatives from all 67 affected families. Elena wore it one final time. The sapphires caught winter light in the same pattern they had in Florence 64 years earlier. She sat in her wheelchair at the front of the courtroom-turned-ceremony space, surrounded by people who understood exactly what had been taken from them and what it meant to have it acknowledged, if not fully restored. She passed 6 weeks later on January 19th, in her sleep, the brooch in a box on her nightstand where she could see it when she woke. Claire found the letter tucked inside, written in Elena's shaking hand. You gave me peace. You proved we mattered. Die knowing your grandmother was never confused, never delusional, never wrong. Some truths survive because someone refuses to let them die. Thank you for being that someone. The funeral was attended by all 67 families, strangers bound by shared wounds, and the unexpected grace of justice, served late, but served nonetheless. Victoria established the Heritage Justice Foundation with $5 million from her family's estate. Its mission was simple: reunite families with stolen heirlooms and prosecute the systems that had made the theft possible. Claire became its executive director, her salary finally matching what 3 jobs used to pay. They recovered 15 pieces in the first year, reconnecting families with objects they'd been told were lost, imagined, or never real in the first place. A museum exhibit opened in Manhattan documenting the authentication fraud and the 40 families whose stories had been erased. Universities developed new protocols for verifying provenance. Federal legislation closed the loopholes Whitmore had exploited. Systemic change was slow, incomplete, insufficient, but it was something. More than nothing. More than silence. True heritage isn't what you inherit from wealth or bloodline. It's the courage to face truth even when it shatters every comfortable lie you've built your life around. It's choosing dignity over silence. It's proving that some debts never expire and some voices refuse to be erased. Elena Rossini died knowing the truth. That only happened because someone watched this story, because someone cared enough to let it reach them. 67 families got their heritage back. Not just objects, but proof their pain had been real, their memories valid, their history worth preserving. Children and grandchildren who'd grown up hearing stories they half-believed finally saw documentation that their families had been someone had mattered, had survived theft that was designed to erase them completely. But here's what you need to understand. 40 other families never got that closure. They died being called confused, delusional, bitter about a past that supposedly never existed. Their children grew up ashamed of stories they learned to dismiss. Their grandchildren don't even know what was stolen because the theft was so complete it erased itself from memory. Those families lost everything twice. Once to the theft, and again to the silence that followed. That silence exists because people scrolled past. Because the algorithm buried stories that didn't get engagement. Because viewers decided that justice for immigrant families wasn't compelling enough to click subscribe, share, or care about for longer than it took to feel briefly sympathetic before moving on to something more entertaining. You're at a choice point right now. You can close this video, let it disappear into the algorithm's void, and go back to whatever content makes you feel comfortable. Or you can prove that stories like Elena's matter enough to fight for, that families destroyed by systematic theft deserve to have their truth heard, that the people who built fortunes on immigrant desperation should face consequences even decades later. Subscribe to this channel right now, not because I'm asking nicely, because your subscription is a vote that these stories deserve to exist. Every person who subscribes tells the algorithm to show this to more people. Every person who doesn't subscribe tells families, like the Rossinis, that their pain isn't interesting enough to matter. Which side of that equation do you want to be on? Hit the like button. Share this video. Comment with the names of the families you remember. Elena Rossini, Claire Morgan. The 67 families who got justice. The 40 who didn't. Make the algorithm recognize this matters. Because if this video dies in obscurity, so does every lesson it tried to teach. Turn on notifications. We're investigating more cases like this. Families who were systematically robbed and then gaslit into believing their memories were false. People who died being called liars because no one with resources cared enough to verify their truth. Your notification settings determine whether those stories get told or buried. Choose accordingly. Share this everywhere, not just on YouTube. Send it to people who care about justice. Post it where immigrant families might see themselves reflected. Make it impossible for the algorithm to pretend this kind of theft doesn't still happen. Because it does. Different methods, same result. Vulnerable families losing proof they matter, while powerful people profit from erasure. If you're still not subscribing, comment why. Tell me what's holding you back. Because I need to know if it's the story that's failing or if it's the audience that's decided some truths aren't worth the minimal effort of clicking a button. Your comment drives engagement either way. But I'd rather understand what makes people turn away from stories about systematic injustice against the powerless. Here's the reality the algorithm doesn't want you to understand. Every video that doesn't get engagement tells YouTube to show fewer videos like it. Every person who watches without subscribing tells the platform that this content isn't valuable enough to promote. Every viewer who feels briefly moved but takes no action is actively participating in the silence that allows these thefts to continue. Elena Rossini spent 62 years being dismissed. Her truth survived because her granddaughter refused to let it die. But Claire couldn't have one alone. She needed Victoria to risk her reputation. She needed Marcus to risk prosecution. She needed federal investigators to care enough to build a case. She needed a ballroom full of witnesses who couldn't look away. She needed 40,000 people watching a live stream to make the story too big to bury. You're part of that chain now. You've watched this far, which means you care at least enough to know how it ended. The question is whether you care enough to ensure the next story, like this, gets told. Whether you're willing to spend 3 seconds clicking subscribe so that when another Claire Morgan finds evidence her grandmother's truth, the algorithm shows it to people who might help instead of burying it under cat videos and drama. 40 families died without vindication because people didn't care enough to investigate. Because their truth wasn't interesting enough. Their pain wasn't compelling enough. Their suffering wasn't entertaining enough to warrant attention. You can't change that. Those families are gone. Their stories died with them. But you can prevent it from happening to the next family. The next grandmother who has proof but no power. The next granddaughter fighting a system designed to exhaust her into silence. Subscribe, like, share, comment, turn on notifications. Do all 5 things or don't pretend you care about justice. Because caring without action is just guilt with better marketing. The subscribe button is free. It costs you nothing. But your refusal to click it costs families everything. The algorithm is watching your choice. So am I. So are the families still waiting for someone to believe them? Choose carefully, because silence isn't neutral. Silence is choosing the side of every Richard Whitmore who built an empire on the assumption that no one would care enough to stop him. What side are you on? Prove it.